Hello and welcome to Triage, timely conversations for healthcare professionals, a podcast created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode is designed to highlight important developments in health law and analyze the impact on our clients and friends of the firm. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Rebecca Schaefer.
This is Mike Hinkle.
We are both partners in the RTP office of K&L Gates and members of the Healthcare and FDA practice group. We're here today to talk about issue spotting, health system, hospital activities that might trigger FDA regulatory oversight. Folks obviously historically and classically tend to think of FDA regulatory requirements attaching to conventional medical device and drug manufacturers, but more and more we're seeing FDA jurisdiction reach down into hospitals and their activities, especially as hospitals advance treatment innovation and discovery through their own care models and programs. So we're here today to talk about the types of activities that might trigger an FDA regulatory consideration aside from just classic serving as a research site of an FDA-regulated trial. So with that, Mike, what first comes to mind as a frequent flyer, but maybe still needs to be an issue spotted in this category?
Rebecca, as you said, I think most hospitals, health systems, they're sort of used to this idea of when we do a clinical study, for example, if they're the investigator site for a clinical study, that there is some FDA regulatory component to that. But many times it's not that heavy. Occasionally FDA may show up. But what we're seeing many times now with these clinical investigations is they're starting to expand. A lot of hospitals, even outside of what sort of traditional academic, may decide they're going to do their own type of research, or they're getting into different areas such as medical devices research, that we're seeing more and more of that present different issues that maybe they haven't thought about. I know you've seen some of that too, like the issue of, is the institution going to be the quote sponsor and have all that FDA burden on their back, or is that going to be the investigator? I know you saw that not long ago.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think you're talking about investigator-initiated trials as distinguished from a classic sponsored research arrangement or clinical trial arrangement with a Merck or a Pfizer or a Boston Scientific. So with these investigator-initiated trials, you have the burden of not only being the investigator, but being the sponsor. And the regulatory issue I've seen come up and institutions debate is who's going to hold that IND or IDE. Are they going to require that the institution hold that or allow the principal investigator to hold that? And, the holder of it is, quote unquote, the sponsor for FDA purposes. And there's some argument, I suppose, institutions would like to make about if as a risk mitigation strategy to let the investigator hold that IND or IDE as then taking on the role of not only investigator, but sponsor for FDA regulatory requirements. But on the other, side of the coin is you really can't disentangle yourself anyway. Institutional resources are going to be used in support of the trial either way. And holding that IND or IDE may better position the institution to affect some controls that will promote compliance. And then there's just the practical consideration of if the investigator changes institutions, if they are the individual holder of the IND or IDE, they take that with them. And that could, be, a brain drain on what could be some intellectual property, potentially even that would otherwise stay with the institution. So I don't know, what else are you seeing or would you flag as FDA regulatory issues in investigator-initiated trials?
Well, I think with clinical trials in general, it's important to remember that the FDA really has jurisdiction over three entities in a typical trial. You have the sponsor that we were just talking about. Obviously, the investigator is actually conducting the study. But FDA also has jurisdiction over the activities of the Institutional Review Board. So these IRBs at sites that oversee the study for primarily to ensure patient subject welfare. And those are a source of a fair amount of FDA oversight and inspection many times, particularly on the medical device side. As we talk about a lot of sites doing more and more medical device type studies. And what's different there is the investigational device exemption, which is a filing with FDA to request to conduct a medical device study. that's only required if the study presents a significant risk to the subjects. And that determination as to whether the study is significant risk or not significant risk, and a not significant risk doesn't require submission to FDA, is made by the IRB. And so that IRB has to take guidance from FDA and apply it to the proposed protocol and the proposed investigational device and determine whether this is significant risk or not. And if they make an NSR, a non-significant risk determination, that means there's going to be no filing to FDA, and FDA is basically outsourced the oversight of that investigation to the IRB. And so when FDA comes in and inspects, and they do from time to time, IRBs, that's one of the things they look at is that IRB properly making that determination? And that can get a lot of IRBs sort of sideways with FDA. And as you do more and more device studies, particularly it's hospitals that aren't maybe used to doing a lot of device studies, and the IRB is not used to doing that, that's sort of a new potential liability or regulatory risks that you have in that investigational space that maybe you're not thinking about. Oftentimes you're not thinking about the IRB being inspected by the FDA, but they do with some regularity.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out. Well, so maybe transitioning a little bit and thinking about the sort of intersection or borderland between research, what's really intended as a research protocol and designed study, to clinical operations, treatment mission of these hospital and health system institutions. So that's my long-winded segue to expanded access to investigational products. What do you flag from an FDA regulatory perspective in that category?
Yeah, I think we've seen there's been a sort of a new focus on that with the TPOXX, a product that was used. It's being used to treat monkeypox during this new emergency for the monkeypox, and these expanded access or compassionate use, whatever you want to call it, FDA calls it expanded access. Some people still call them treatment INDs or compassionate use INDs. But what it really is it's still an investigational use of a drug or device, could be, but it's being used to treat people instead of just for the purpose of research and collecting data. But where sometimes people get confused and get mixed up here is that it's still an IND, and there are still certain things that have to be done. Now, the sponsor for the TPOXX monkeypox expanded access IND is actually CDC, and they've streamlined a lot of things, made it a lot easier. But that's not always the case many times with treatment INDs, and there's still a lot of hurdles that have to be sort of cleared to make sure you stay in compliance. And many times we start thinking compassionate use just means, hey, I can use it any way I want to, and there's no record keeping or anything has to be done. So there's some boxes that need to be checked, I's dotted and T's across when you're doing these expanded access or treatment INDs. It's like one of those things that you think about that maybe you're not thinking about as we go into more treatment INDs. And compassionate use becomes more common, and I think it is going forward. It's sort of been a push for that. So, but that's sort of in that realm of what we think of hospitals. It's still research and so forth. I think one of the things that we're thinking through things here that hospitals are facing now that we're seeing more situations where hospitals actually become manufacturers of FDA regulated products.
Yeah.
Puts them in a whole different category. I mean, historically, FDA has kind of looked at hospitals like, okay, well, you do research and you treat people.
No.
That's entirely outside of FDA's authority. But once you start making manufacturing drug products or devices, it really puts you in a different category.
Well, yeah, and let me jump in with a couple examples and let you expand on them, because that's exactly where I was going next, is even just in treatment initiatives and classic, clinical care, there are some activities that might be a tripwire for being regulated as a manufacturer. And some that come to mind, for me, and I'd really love to hear you expand on, are producing CAR T cells or pancreatic islet cells as a therapy, or even 3D printing. And I know those are two different topics, but they, may have in common activities that would trigger, implications for complying with manufacturing requirements under FDA.
I mean, those are really good examples, and really two different areas: the biologic space with the cell culture, cultured cells type products. Now, And many times hospitals kind of ease into that if they're part of that. So for anyone who may not know, I mean, these are cells essentially that are taken out of a patient and are treated in some way in a laboratory and then put back in to the same patient. And the treatment results in some therapeutic benefit to the patient, whether that's for cancer, and oftentimes it's some type of cancer therapy. And what happens many times, the hospital may be involved in the clinical trial in doing that, and then they continue to treat their patients once that biologic license application or BLA gets approved for that. But the thing to remember there is that processing that happens in the laboratory at the hospital many times is considered drug manufacturing. So it's subject to FDA's, what they call their current good manufacturing practices, which sounds pretty innocuous, but actually is a extremely burdensome record keeping and testing and everything else.
You don't mess around with the GMPs.
Yeah, it's a tough, very burdensome thing to take on. But in that case, many times you're getting some help from the manufacturer, who obviously wants the hospital to succeed there and to be able to manufacture the product for them. The other example you had, the 3D printing, is really almost very different in the sense that you can get sideways with FDA and really in a really innocent way and not even realize you've done it many times as a hospital. And, for example, with the supply chain problems we've seen, and then you say, well, I can't get this part. I need this on an IV pole, for example, to hang my fusion bags on. I can't get this. But with 3D printers being cheap as they are now, maybe to say, hey, we've got a 3D printer. It's just a plastic piece. We can make the thing. And it seems pretty innocuous. It's innocent. Hey, I need it. Supply chain says I can't get it. Why can't I just make the thing with my 3D printer? And it may be an innocent thing, but on the other hand, it may actually be medical device manufacturing, which puts you under the good manufacturing practices for medical devices are called the quality system regulation, and they're also very burdensome. And plus, there's a potential that the piece that you're manufacturing may actually need FDA approval or clearance, they call it, in order to be used. Now, FDA is struggling with how to deal with these issues as well, and some are low risk and some may be higher risk, depending on exactly what you're doing. But the 3D printer can present different kinds of risks. The cell culture, like the CAR T cells, I mean, that takes a lot of planning and preparation and bringing in consultants and so forth to set that up. The 3D printer, you need to look at that on a case by case and see where you're coming out on that.
You said lower barriers to entry as a practical matter if you've got a 3D printer. And so maybe this is just a word of alert, I suppose, to check out what's happening in your innovation space and among the innovation and strategic initiatives arms of the organization to maybe, canvas if some of these activities are in the pipeline or underway that might be triggering FDA oversight and regulatory obligations you might not have realized. Well, so Mike, what haven't we mentioned? I mean, just sort of a catch-all in terms of frequently occurring hospital whole system activities that have FDA implications.
Well, there are also some registration requirements that are not as heavily regulated, but say, for example, certain tissues, human cellular and tissue-based products, HCTPs, they call them. So certain tissue products, stem cells, reproductive cells, if they're being collected and stored and then used in the hospital, that may require an FDA registration. It's actually under the Public Health Service Act. So there's some good, what they call good tissue practices on how you collect those tissues and store them and that sort of thing. And that's also FDA regulated, as well as just sort of traditional blood banks. There's different levels of FDA regulation. FDA regulates blood as a biologic. And so depending on what the hospital's doing with the blood, are they just merely buying it and using it, or are they actually doing some testing, or are they doing their own collection? If you're doing your own collection, that's an FDA regulated blood bank, and there are certain requirements for that. And that's also FDA regulated. So yeah, there's a number of things there that come to mind there, in addition to what we've talked about, where hospitals may not realize that FDA actually does have jurisdiction over what they're doing.
Yep. Well, you're always my first call when I'm not sure if there's an FDA issue. So I'm grateful for your time and your perspective and insights today. Thanks for being here.
Well, it's good. It's good to talk to you. One nice thing about our practice here is we have a combined healthcare and FDA. And so we see this intersection between our hospital clients and our FDA regulatory issues and FDA clients. And it really makes for a nice being able to see the whole picture and view it in this holistic sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you. And thanks as well to our Triage audience for tuning in. Take care.
Thanks again for listening to Triage, timely conversations for healthcare professionals. New episodes are available for download through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. By subscribing to Triage, you will receive timely notifications for each new episode. Also, if you have any topics you would like to hear discussed on Triage, please don't hesitate to email triagesupport@klgates.com. We would love to hear from you.